Imagine a tangled rope, a lump of knots and twists with two ends sticking out. Now, if we want to untangle this rope, we can't just pull on those ends. In fact, that'll make it even worse. We need to work our way through the tangle, through the knots, slowly, delicately, painstakingly, untying and unweaving until the rope is untangled. Today, for me, that tangled rope is our current conversation about the line between anti-Israel criticism and anti-Semitism. And the more we pull on the ends of that tangled rope, the worse it gets. With inflammatory comments on either side of the political spectrum, comments like, Ben and Jerry are anti-Semites, or Israel is committing genocide. We are simply pulling on the ends of the rope and causing more knots, more pain, and more division in our community. To untangle this rope, we must be in relationship with one another. We must listen, dialogue, and be open to the nuance beyond polarizing sound bites. One of my favorite parts about being in a large, diverse congregation such as this is our varying opinions that reflect our varying life experiences. We are taught in the Talmud that when seeing a large group of Jews, we say the blessing, "Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who knows secrets." Why? The Talmud continues, God sees a whole nation whose minds are unlike each other. Our myriad of opinions are literally a blessing. I'm excited to share that we have recently convened a renewed Israel Engagement Task Force here at Road of Shalom to learn from one another and to help untangle that rope. We just held our first meeting, and we spent the time simply listening to one another. We heard stories such as a life-changing visit to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, or living in Israel in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. I shared my own story about my first time in Israel and the immense pride and connection I felt when my younger brother became a bar mitzvah on the top of Mount Masada. I shared the story of how my wife's grandparents met in Tel Aviv shortly after the Holocaust and fell in love. And I shared about seeing Israel anew through the eyes of our young people, our Road of Shalom teens, as they discovered this complicated country for themselves on one of our congregational trips. Our renewed task force is not working in a vacuum, but rather we are working in close partnership with the URJ's, the Union for Reform Judaism's Israel Leadership Network, a network of lay and professional leaders coming together to further the Reform movement's connection to Israel and reform Zionism. Reform Zionism is the belief in both Israel's right to exist and security and the Palestinians' right to self-determination. After the conflict in Gaza last spring, Rabbi Maderer wrote an opinion piece in The Inquirer entitled, "My empathy for Palestinians does not diminish my devotion to Judaism." In the piece, she writes, "Any position that entirely demonizes one side or the other misses the humanity in both. Any positions that entirely affirm the pure right of one side or the other miss the responsibility in both. devotion both to Israel's right to exist and the Palestinians' right to self-determination, as taught by Reform Zionism, is not often appreciated by the far right or the far left. Moderation does not lack a stance. It denies the extremists and rejects a false binary, holding space for multiple narratives and histories." End quote. The extremists that Rabbi Mader writes about are pulling on the ends of the rope, refusing to accept multiple narratives. Reform Zionism is in the middle, trying to untangle the knot. So let's get into that tangle. The line between anti-Israel comments and anti-Semitism has become blurred to much of society, and we must clearly mark what is acceptable criticism of Israel and what is not. Let me begin by stating as clearly as possible: criticism of Israel is not automatically anti-Semitic. On multiple occasions, our congregation has invited civil rights activist Anat Hoffman, one of the fiercest critics of Israeli policy, who shines a light on human rights abuses committed by the state against women, against Arab Israelis, and against progressive Jews. Anat Hoffman is not an anti-Semite. We heard from former IDF soldiers as part of the group Breaking the Silence, who spoke about the pain of seeing Palestinians suffer while serving in the West Bank. These soldiers are not anti-Semites. And myself and other members of our clergy have spoken about policies of the Israeli government that go against our very Jewish values. We are not anti-Semites. However, there are sadly many instances where criticism of Israel does cross the line and clearly becomes anti-Semitism. One framework for determining whether criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic is the 3D test, conceived of by Natan Sharansky. The 3 Ds are delegitimization, double standard, and demonization. When people deny only the Jewish people's right to self-determination, when they characterize a return to our homeland of 3,000 years as a white, colonialist, racist endeavor, and call into question Israel's very right to exist, this delegitimization is anti-Semitism. And when the United Nations Human Rights Council calls out Israel for half of all of their human rights condemnations, more than the resolutions against Syria, Iran, and North Korea combined, this double standard is anti-Semitism. And when the Israeli Defense Force is characterized as terrorists, as Nazis, wantonly killing Palestinians in a genocide, this demonization is anti-Semitism. Delegitimization, the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, double standards, a different moral standard for Jews and Israel compared to the rest of the world, and demonization, the portrayal of Israel and Jews as evil, demonic, or other sinister stereotypes. This summer, Ben & Jerry's made the controversial decision to stop selling ice cream in the West Bank settlements. While some applauded the decision and others criticized it, it is actually an incredibly nuanced and good example of the tangle that is the Israel debate in our Jewish community and beyond. In the spirit of understanding multiple perspectives, let's take a look at this particular tangled knot. Now, I'm still not sure where I fall exactly on the debate, but let me lay out some of the issues as I see them. First, This boycott only applies to West Bank settlements, not all of Israel. This action is not the same as the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction movement, which often seeks to boycott all of Israel and ultimately, for many in the movement, to deny Israel its right to self-determination. While our congregation does not support BDS because of these deceptive goals, the nuanced approach of only boycotting West Bank settlements while still selling ice cream in the rest of Israel is actually a very good reflection of our Reform Zionism. Second, any settlement boycott that only applies to the West Bank raises questions of targeting Israel with a double standard. Now, I don't know if Ben & Jerry's sells ice cream in Tibet or Crimea or Western Sahara. And even if it does, it is legitimate for people to care about some issues more than others. I do not find it automatically anti-Semitic that someone is more emotionally invested in what happens to Palestinians than what happens to Uyghurs, for instance. Third, a one-size-fits-all approach to settlements makes for bad policy, and that applies here as well. Not all settlers are hardline fundamentalists who believe that the entirety of the biblical land of Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza, were divinely promised to the Jewish people. Some settlers, just average people, just like you and I, who are trying to buy a decent house in the suburbs and provide for their families. Decades of Israeli government policy, irrespective of which party was in power, have promoted West Bank settlements that abut the Green Line and provided incentives for people to move there. These so-called quality of life settlements that the Palestinians are willing to cede to Israel as part of future land swap negotiations are not the same as ideologically driven, toxic settlements deep inside the West Bank that are nefariously designed to destroy Palestinian contiguity. Lastly, given the history of boycotts against Jews, this is a sensitive topic. Now, comparing Ben & Jerry's to Nazis is outrageous. Denying Chunky Monkey to settlers is not the Nuremberg Laws or Kristallnacht. No matter how many people on your social media feed say so. Still, that does not negate the fact that there is a long and ugly history of boycotting Jews and restricting their economic activities. Now, the problem with everything I just laid out, it won't fit into a pithy, short social media post. While social media can be a tool for real dialogue, often it is used to oversimplify issues and lacks the subtlety needed to have an authentic conversation around a really complex issue. Holding space for multiple narratives requires empathy. It requires listening to others and learning from them. Among the litany of sins that we communally confess today in our vidui is the sin of being stubborn. We just chanted in our Ashamnu prayer, Kishinu Oref. We have been stubborn. Kishinu Oref literally translates to being stiff-necked. We are unwilling to turn our heads to see another person. We are unwilling to look our friend, our neighbor in the eye and seek to understand their point of view. We have refused to have empathy for others' opinions and narratives. We have refused to be willing to bend to change our opinions in light of new narratives. We have been fearful and acted based on our insecurities, which drive us to think only about security. We have refused to grow and learn. Kishinu oref. We have been stiff-necked. Our communal confessional reminds us that we are one community and that we are all responsible for one another. And we have a responsibility to engage with Israel, to learn, to visit, to hear the stories, and to truly understand for ourselves. I love Israel. I love the land. I love the people. I love the culture. I love the food. I love the discomfort. I love the challenges. And I love the discourse. If you have not already, I pray that all of us might find our own connection to Israel this year. We have space in our community for a multifaceted perspective on Israel, and sharing those different narratives is what brings our community closer together. So let's stop pulling on the ends of the ropes, and let's untangle this knot together. Good Yontif.